Welcome to Freddy's Huge Ask Podcast. Huge lives and the stories behind them. And now here's your host, Freddy Cruz.
Ruta Sepetys is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of 5 novels and a graphic novel, including Between Shades of Grey, which was adapted into the movie Ashes in the Snow. She is a Carnegie Medal recipient. She has spoken to Congress, NATO, and the European Parliament. Her 5th novel is titled I Must Betray You. It is already one of my favorites of 2022. I know we're not even through Q1 yet, but I love this book. And Ruta joins the show right now. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join this little podcast. Now, I want to talk about the book and all of the things that were woven into the story, but I want to go back to little Ruta and your roots, your origin story, all the things that led you to becoming the 2022 version of yourself. So books, TV shows, movies, what kinds of songs you were listening to.
Oh, I love this. Okay, well, I am the daughter of a Lithuanian refugee and a West Prussian mother. And I was born and raised in Detroit, home of my heart, Motor City. And I loved reading and I loved music. I read James and the Giant Peach, was one of my first books by Roald Dahl. And I was, convinced that I wanted to become a writer. And in 3rd grade, my 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Zimmer, gave us a creative writing assignment. And this was perfect. I was going to write the great American novel. And her only prompt was take the expected and make it unexpected. Okay. So this book was called The Adventures of Betsy. And it was a big hit in the classroom. One of my friends took it home. Her mom called my mom and said, "Have you read The Adventures of Betsy?" And my mom said no. And she said, "Well, I think you should. There's something seriously wrong with Ruta." And long story short, yes, The Adventures of Betsy became a banned book in 3rd grade. And what child wants to be the center of an enduring drama in 3rd grade? And my friends tried to, defend me. My teacher, she gave me an A on the assignment. Now, mind you, this was in the 70s. So there was a lot of stranger danger in the 70s. There were sadly abductions. There were all these public service announcements and after school specials, don't get in the car with a stranger. Mm-hmm. So take the expected and make it unexpected. Betsy was 9 and her adventures were with a 30-year-old dude who lived in a windowless van.
Oh, no.
And the parents did not understand the writing prompt and it became a big drama. And I tell you this because I always wanted to be a writer and that stole my courage. It stole my courage. And I was convinced I was a failure at 9 years old. And I thought, well, gosh, I failed at music. What can I do now? At reading, what can I do now? And writing, I went into the music business. I loved music. What did I love? I loved Van Halen. I loved all sorts of hard rock. I loved Boston, like all those big 70s rock bands. And for 22 years, I worked in the music business between Los Angeles and Nashville. And I was storytelling, but through music. I mean, a song is a 3-minute story, right? Yeah. And I learned that through working in music, that when the songwriters put an element of their own personal story into the song, it was way more likely to become successful. So I constantly asked people, what's your story? What's your story? And one day, one of these snarky musicians asked me what my story was. And that kicked off this whole new career of becoming an author, because my answer about my story was, I'm Lithuanian. And he said, I'm so sorry. How long have you had that? And it made me realize there's a lot of history out there that people are unaware of. And what
Lithuanian is in like you were diseased or something.
Completely.
How long do you have to live?
Exactly. I'm so sorry, honey. How long have you had that? He said it so seriously. And but he also really challenged me. He said, for 20 years, you've been asking everyone, what's your story? And you've been encouraging us to put it into our art, into our music. And your answer is that your story is that you're Lithuanian. He said, with all due respect, no one knows what that means. What does that mean? And that sent me soul searching. And here we are, today.
So you moved to LA with a typewriter and $63, and that's kind of part of that story, right? So I want to know how long it took for you to get off your feet. Not that we would recommend anyone really do that in 2022 or ever, but when you took that chance, what was going through your mind? How long did you think that you would take to kind of achieve whatever it was that you were trying to achieve at that moment?
Well, I think I have to also explain that when you are a child of immigrants, my parents truly believed that as long as I got an education, anything was possible. I could have said, I want to be a naked astronaut. And they would say, good, you can be a naked astronaut, just get an education. And so when I said I want to be a rock and roll manager and move to Los Angeles, my parents, they actually were encouraging. But no, I don't recommend going with $60 and living in a crack alley where I did, off of Yucca in Hollywood. But I truly thought that it would take years, to tell you the truth. I really thought it would. But LA, although it's a place where you can have an intense intimacy with loneliness, things can also happen there. There can also be these magical, things that happen in LA. And I was fortunate. My brother was working for a producer and they needed an intern. And here I was. And I was given this job working for this songwriter who was working with mega, best-selling recording artists.
When asked to give advice to young writers, you've told them to get their hearts broken, thrown on the ground, stomped on a few times, to be an outcast. I mean, you clearly achieved that in the 3rd grade with your Stranger Danger story. But can we get a personal example outside of the Betsy novel, the Betsy book, or can we get a personal example from any or all of these suggestions that have helped you as a storyteller?
Yes, and thank you for asking this, because I truly believe that some of the best building blocks for character development, for plot, are embedded within our own experience. And that if we write from that experience, even if the topic that we're writing about is not our own life, but if we pull from that emotional well, it's going to be more resonant. So I was quite a failure on the romance angle. I mean, it took me a long time, and I had many, failed attempts. But I do remember one Valentine's Day, I thought I had a date and went to this very posh restaurant in Los Angeles. And I had paid in advance because it was impossible to get, reservations, where this guy had said, oh, let's go there. I said, great, I'll make the reservation. You had to pay in advance. And he never showed up. And I sat there and waited way too long, so long that other diners started to feel bad and send me drinks. Someone asked if I was a widow. All of these things. And as I was sitting there, that sadness, that humiliation, it was great training to become a writer. Failure. I have failed so many times. And now when I'm writing these characters, I pull from those emotional experiences, like Valentine's Day.
Yeah, well, and failure, it seems to me like it's almost still like a dirty word in 2022. And I mean, you can spend time on LinkedIn as a grown up, but kids aren't on LinkedIn. They're on Instagram, and they're seeing all the wins and they're seeing the highlights, but they're not seeing Ruta with, I don't know if you get writer's block, but if you're staring at a blank page or whatnot, they didn't see you on Valentine's Day getting stood up by this guy. all they see are Ruta's amazing stories, right? So is there a failure that maybe you learned from through somebody else? Like someone did something, I don't know, you're watching the Super Bowl, someone threw a game losing touchdown or something.
Oh my goodness, so many. And actually, as a child, my parents really believed that failure was a prerequisite to success. So often, when they would fail, they would point out their failure and kind of teach me to laugh about it. For example, setting my hair on fire in the backseat of the car back in the 70s when people would, smoke and in the car with the windows rolled up. And but everything it was a learning experience. But you're definitely right. People have said or assume that my path to publication was so easy. Oh my goodness, it was anything but easy. I remember my first attempt at writing when I came back from the misadventures of Betsy. I wanted to write this middle grade mystery, and I took it to a writing conference, and paid for a critique and was assigned a critique, not with an editor, but a publisher, like the head of the whole, imprint. And this publisher told me that my book was obnoxious, annoying, and that my narrative voice was grating. And I said, oh, so I was so nervous. And that feeling when heat is rising up your neck and you think, don't cry, don't cry. And so this person said, you're obnoxious, annoying, your narrative voice is grating. I said, would you like to see more? What was I thinking? And this person said, if I had to read one more word, Ruta, I think I would hang myself. And I don't think people see those, those situations. It seems like, oh, it's a #1 New York Times bestseller. No, oh my gosh, give me a fistful of matches. I was ready to burn it all down. And I had to regroup and start over again and again. But I'm so glad that happened. It's made me tougher.
I never knew Gordon Ramsay was working in the publishing industry. Good Lord.
That is a great comparison. And actually, I am not able to reveal who this inspirational publisher was. But you know what? Come to think of it, the personality was kind of similar. Yeah.
Golly. So one of the things, because I've read more than one of your stories, I am just enamored with your style of writing. And maybe it's because I like to kind of explore that shadow and that dark side of humanity, and not everybody likes that. But you do it in such a way that is approachable and digestible. Kids read these stories. I mean, my kid, she's a science and math girl, not so much into reading, Between Shades of Gray was the first book that she read, like long, like quote unquote real book, not toddler picture book, the first real book that she read that she was really into. And so it got me curious into about your work. And so I want to know what moments in your life or history made you want to write about these kinds of things.
Well, the spark happened. I was still working in the music business, and this musician had said, oh, well, what's your story? And it just so happened that one of my clients was touring in Lithuania, and I went on the tour, and I had never been to Lithuania at that point. Lithuania had regained their independence in 1991. My father went back, and when my father went back, they were not open with him about the fact that when he and his parents fled, that the Soviet secret police came looking for the family. And when they couldn't find them, they arrested and deported 12 of our extended family members to labor camps and death camps and gulags in Siberia. This was part of my own family history. My father didn't know that had happened. And in school, I had studied Hitler and the Holocaust, but I hadn't studied Stalin and the victims of communism. And yet this was a story that affected my own family, and my freedom came at the expense of these extended family members who perished in Siberia. And that I just really, it made me ask, what is history hiding from us? And what determines how history is preserved and recalled? Why is it that some of these pieces of history become part of the collective consciousness, and then other stories just sort of remain tucked in the shadows? And that was what really inspired me.
Yeah, well, and I've wrestled with this too, because I'm like, well, growing up as a Cold War kid, obviously, I'm in my 40s. And I remember seeing the pictures in the history books of FDR and Churchill and Stalin. Well, who is this Stalin guy? Oh, he was with Russia. Wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to hate the Russians because they're the communists. And of course, I'm a kid, so I have no idea about communism and socialism and Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto and the 10 pillars of communism and the gulags and all that stuff. And it's just, it is insane to me that there is so much to learn about all of this, and why some of this was, I don't want to say swept under the rug, but geez, if we're not learning about this stuff as a kid, you grow up not knowing about it as an adult.
It's a great point. And we see these figures of, over 20 million people lost their lives, under Stalin's reign. And what we don't know is that the majority of that 20 million, they were the Russian people themselves. The Russian people suffered terribly under Stalin. So yeah, there's so many, history has many angles, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, and I want to get to your book, but you talk about that, and I immediately think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago, where and I'm paraphrasing, but the passage was something of, he sends you to die in war, but if you don't want to fight in a war to defend Russia, you go back and then you end up getting killed anyway.
There you go. Exactly. Exactly. And those untold stories, and just those, painting in broad strokes that, the Russians are our enemies, and it's way too general, way too general. There's so much history there to unpack.
Yeah, well, and I want to get to I Must Betray You. The title is just chef's kiss. All right. I could be someone completely unfamiliar with your work, and it's like, whoa, I must betray you. I'm picking that up right now.
Thank you. Authors don't always get final say on the title. And when I did approach my editor, she said, wait a minute, I love that. I love that. And I don't know if you want me to explain a little, or if we should talk about the book first. Or
no, let's talk about the title. Because I mean, in reading the book, it's like, it's more than just I must betray you. It's we must betray each other. I must betray her and him, and he's got to betray me.
Exactly. Well, the story follows a 17-year-old high school student who is blackmailed to inform for the Romanian secret police. And he's expected to inform on his teachers, on his neighbors, on his friends, even on his family and on his girlfriend. But instead of betraying those he loves, he decides, no, wait, I'm going to betray this regime. And this is on the eve of revolution in Romania. And the other reason that I chose that title is that the dictator in Romania at the time, Nicolae Ceaușescu, he betrayed so many other countries, including the United States. He duped us. He betrayed his own people. And in recruiting them to be informers, they even in some cases not only betrayed others, but betrayed themselves. And I thought that was so evil and so manipulative that I thought that the title maybe had multiple meanings.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Ceaușescu guy, I had actually watched that video of the incident, which is in the book, not knowing it was him. And I'm like, okay, I want to Google this guy. When I found out that I was interviewing you, I'm like, yes. All right. Now, Nicolae Ceaușescu. Okay. Romania. Okay. Oh, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. Oh, sweet. So I'm looking, I'm like, wait a minute. I've seen that video before. I've seen the video. Oh my God. That's who that is. And yeah, it is crazy what these people were able to do with absolutely no weaponry.
Well, and that's what really inspired me to choose a main character who was a student, because during my research, what continually came up was how brave the young people were. And they suffered so terribly. These were young people who had hopes and dreams, but no ability whatsoever to chart the course of their own destiny. And when the uprising happened, these young people took to the streets, as you said, with nothing but their bare hands. And Ceaușescu gave an order to gun them down. I mean, most of these regimes were bloodless transfers of power during the fall of communism. And we remember those media moments of, atop the Berlin Wall or the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. But I didn't know this story, and I wanted to illuminate, the hearts and the courage and the fortitude of these young Romanians.
Yeah. And you're listening to this podcast, and not only are these kids rising up with no weapons, there is no Second Amendment, there's no First Amendment, there is no Bill of Rights. Okay. These kids, and this is real life. I mean, they're a can of Coca-Cola is a luxury. And Ruta, you talk about the Kents in the story, and some of the things that these people are having to go through. But I want to ask you, there are a couple of specific things about how you weave in the history of Romania and some of these things with the research that you do. The 20,000 Bibles turned into toilet paper. Was that a real negative history?
Yes, yes. And so then the question is, I come upon this in my research that the United States sends 20,000 Bibles intended for the Romanian people to bring them hope, and Ceaușescu tears them apart and turns them into toilet paper. And the true witnesses that I met with, the Romanians, they were explaining this, this toilet paper. And then the challenge is, how do I incorporate that into the book without it just being telling or an info dump? And that's such a challenge for me, because I have all this information that I'm passionate to convey, but I can't always get it in there. But yes, the Bibles, that's a real story. Yeah.
It's heartbreaking. And I guess the mentality is that, well, I am God, not your special little books or whatever, is what I'm guessing if I had to get inside the head of this guy and inside the head of any dictator, really, because that's who they are at their core.
And that really became apparent for me. I mean, you can read things and you can watch video and when I was in Bucharest for research and I went into his personal residence, I had seen these communist blocks and how the Romanians were living. There were some elderly Romanians that still lived in these vintage, sort of Soviet style blocks, and they invited me in and they were so generous. And then I went to Ceaușescu's personal palace. And that's when I was so nauseous. Freddie, it was just to see how the disparity and how he was living. And the daughter had, was serving veal to her dog. And these people were standing in line in the freezing cold, waiting for a scrap of bread. And it just broke my heart.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about the story, there's a lot that I love about the story. It's like it's multi-textured. You've got photos at the beginning and the end. You've got like the reports from the Securitate that are written, and so the fonts are written as if they're from a typewriter. You got the notebook, so it looks like it's handwritten in a notebook. Then you got the quote unquote regular text, right? But I want to go to the very opening passage, which the first few sentences remind me. I thought I was reading about the NSA. I mean, it's just creepy in so many ways. But I got to ask you, what parallels do you see between Romania's intelligence apparatus and 21st century surveillance? And do you see? keeping in mind, none of us has a crystal ball, but I mean, do you see any of this getting better? I mean, what are your thoughts on some of these parallels?
Well, I think this was also a bit different because the collection and the collection of information and the surveillance was so targeted. What's frightening now is it's so widespread, but then it was so targeted to specifically manipulate and threaten a human being. And when you look in the Securitate archives and you read the reports, and there could be thousands of pages on one person or on one family, and what they're reporting and how they are planning these manipulations, it's so calculated that it's chilling. So I think the comparison is that this was a bit more focused and calculated with a specific end game instead of just collecting info on everybody.
Well, and then it begs the question, well, would you rather have everything surveilled and it's all targeted toward only the bad guys and your, I don't know, your shopping preferences, so you get the algorithms pick you up? It's such a slippery slope when you think about it.
Well, but I will say that, so there was the surveillance, but then Ceaușescu, to control the population, it's estimated that he recruited 1 in every 10 citizens to be an informer for the regime. And I would prefer to be under that sort of surveillance than to be in an atmosphere of informers. Why? With the other stories that I've written, where there were victims of communism, of fascism, where people were suffering under a terror of tyranny, they had a unity in victimhood, and they at least found comfort and companionship and solidarity in their experience. What Ceaușescu did was so evil, creating this atmosphere of mistrust. There was no solidarity. And imagine what a lonely and terrifying existence that has to be. So I would say I would take the surveillance over the atmosphere of informers.
You talk about companionship, and it reminds me of something I read, companionship and a passage where Christian was thankful for the darkness of communism, something like that.
Yes.
And
yes.
I'm just like, whew, yeah.
Well, think about it. What I tried to, when I say think about it, this was such an oppressive atmosphere of enforced obedience. You had no privacy whatsoever. What does that mean for a young person who is meeting someone and connecting with another human being in a really meaningful way, and just to hold the girl that he loves for a minute in the dark, that he was able to be thankful for that and to think of that for that moment, how much we take for granted. Oh my goodness, how much. And I wanted the reader to feel that in that moment.
Well, you made me feel it, and I like to think that I've at least done a little bit of studying on communism, and it just, reading just page after page after page. The writing itself is just, it lends itself to just keeping up, with the story and turning and turning and turning. But the more I read, the more I was getting angry, and then there was a part where I felt like I was about to start crying. There were 2 parts actually, and it's just like this roller coaster of emotions, and knowing what some of these people went through in real life. Now, my knowledge of the Romanian Revolution is very, very limited, but the knowledge of what happened with the Soviet Union and in the mid 20th century and then during the Cold War is just, it was something. And yeah, it just, it's a roller coaster.
I felt the same way as I was researching it and sitting, and imagine the gift that it is to sit with a true witness who's generous enough to revisit this traumatic time period and share that with you. And it was a roller coaster for me when I was listening to what they were telling me, and then even as they began to speak of the impending revolution, and when the revolution came, their words were speeding up. And I thought, well, when I'm recreating this for the reader, I want to recreate that pacing. As the reader's reading, what I attempted to do was to increase the pacing. So all of a sudden the revolution arrives and it just sort of takes off.
Okay, so the amount of research that goes into a historical novel, I imagine, is a lot. And by the way, there are a lot of articles and books that you can refer to at the end of the book, which I love, by the way, Ruta. But I got to ask you how many pages, because I've seen a YouTube video of David Baldacci with a big, huge blue notebook, and then he says he'll use like maybe a sentence or a paragraph. So how much did you have? And then you whittled it down to quote unquote only 290 pages. Are you talking like thousands and thousands, thousands and thousands of minutes worth of interviews? How were you able to organize everything to get this one cohesive narrative whittled down into a novel?
Yes, and yes. thousands and thousands of pages, thousands of hours, so many trips to back and forth to Romania. And I do make it a little bit hard on myself. I could use Scrivener. I could use a program that would help me organize everything, but I don't. What I do is I read all the nonfiction first, and I do all of my nonfiction research, academic papers, dissertations, memoir, biography. So when I would travel to Romania, I would have a knowledge of the working knowledge of the history. It would be rude and inconsiderate to ask someone to give me a history lesson. So I do all of that first. And then when I travel to the place, that's when everything else starts to sort of take shape. Through my interviews with witnesses, characters begin to emerge. And that's when I'm making notes, and I write and research at the same time so I don't lose the emotional immediacy, because sometimes these interviews are so emotionally charged, and I don't want to lose that. I want to incorporate that for the reader. So I have folders on my laptop. I have handwritten notes. I have a research journal. And yes, out of thousands of pages, one sentence might be something that I say, okay, I need to adapt and work off this fact and put it into a scene. I have so much research on Radio Free Europe. I could probably write 3 books just on Radio Free Europe. And I do, and maybe you do the same thing. Do you go down rabbit holes? You are researching a topic, and then, one thing leads to the other, and you're down some rabbit hole about something entirely different.
Those darn algorithms on YouTube. Yes.
Totally. Yes.
It's giving us what we want.
And sometimes though, I will discover something and think, oh my goodness. But one of my interview questions is always, is there anyone else that you feel that I should speak to? And then they'll say, you need to speak to this person, this person, this person. And so then I have my marching orders and my assignments, and I have to go find those people. I don't record the interviews though. I've found over the years that it changes the chemistry when you put a phone or a recording device, especially in this case, think about it in this, with the associated history of surveillance, that people become fearful of being on record. So I just take handwritten notes. I don't record during an interview.
One of the people that you spoke with was on the firing squad that executed the Ceaușescus. How did that go? And I mean, what were your thoughts when you first met this guy? What was it like? I mean, living history.
Yes, and think of this. So it's Christmas, and a military commander comes to a young man and says, "Soldier, are you up for a Christmas Day mission?" And he says, "Yes." And they put him in the helicopter with 2 other soldiers. And once they're airborne, they tell them that upon landing, there is going to be a very brief trial through which Ceaușescu and his wife will be found guilty of genocide, and the sentence will be death. And mind you, this is a soldier who his entire life, this is beloved leader. This is, the leader that he is serving. And he had to complete that mission. And they said, soldier, can you complete this mission? And again, if we talk about the generosity, this man traveled hours and hours to meet with me. And I said, no, let me come to you. No, he said, I would prefer not to be in my hometown. I would, I'd prefer to travel to you. We met at my publisher's office in Bucharest. He was nervous. I was nervous. And he expressed that he still gets nervous talking about this. But the first thing he said that I just will never forget, he said, Ruta, you have to understand, a revolution eats its heroes. And he went on to explain how initially, after the Ceaușescus were executed, that this was a heroic, endeavor. But then when a replacement set of communists took over and there was this nostalgia then all of a sudden he was no longer so heroic. And the complexity of that and what it did to his life, what it did to his personal life. And also, not to mention that he said as a soldier, he was trained, military are trained in military combat. And Ceaușescu's wife was to him a civilian. And there were so many layers of it and it was so complex. And I think both of us afterward, it was definitely the heaviest, most intense interview that I did for the entire, project.
Quick lightning round, Ruta. What's the last book you read and what are you currently reading?
The last book I read was Fallout, Cold War novel, Cold War nonfiction by Steve Schenken. And the book that I am currently reading is Ann Patchett's new collection of essays.
What is your favorite place to write? And do you write longhand or on a laptop?
I write both longhand. I write dialogue longhand. I write everything else on a laptop. My favorite place to write is our family cabin, which is in the middle of nowhere. It's super quiet.
What is the most overused word in books?
Very. Very. And do we really need to say very? I use it all the time. I go through my manuscripts and I find it. Get that out of there. Very.
Why should somebody inspired by your work open up their laptop or notebook and grind out their first manuscript?
Because writing gives us a peek through the keyhole into our own self. When we are writing, the writer often puts themselves on the page too. And so it gives us a deeper sense of self, even if we're not writing about our own story. There are lessons embedded therein.
If you can have dinner with the Ceaușescus, knowing what you know about them, what would you say? What would you ask them?
I would say, Mr. Ceaușescu, power to the one who doesn't want it. That's what I would say to him. So what would I say to him and what would I ask then?
Yeah. Or what would you ask? I mean, I imagine there'd be a lot you could talk about.
Right. No, but I would definitely, my standpoint is, the most powerful humans, truly the most powerful are the ones who don't seek, power. And that, these dictators, the love of power. What if we talked about, the power of love? And of course he would dismiss me and laugh at me, but I would try anyway. And the other thing I would ask is, why has he robbed the world of access to the beauty that is the country of Romania? That in isolating his country and isolating his people, he has denied the world access. Romania is a beautiful country. Romanian people are intelligent and talented and inspiring. And why is he robbing the world of that resource?
If you could skywrite a message, a short one, for the 13% of Gen Z kids who think that communism deserves consideration in the United States, what would it read?
Every human being deserves the chance to be the author of their own destiny.
RutaSepetys.com is the website to go to get all of the books, and you do want all of the books. Ruta, R-U-T-A, Sepetys, S-E-P-E-T-Y-S, RutaSepetys.com. HistoryIsHiding.com is another one. And of course, that new book, it's out, I Must Betray You. I have a feeling this is going to be like my top three pick. One of my top three picks. Ruta, thank you so much. It's been an honor to talk with you on the podcast.
The honor is mine. This is so rare that I have a chance to speak to someone who is so well versed in and has read the book and is so well prepared and, serves up a lightning round that was just wicked. That was intense. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is a presidential alert. The First Amendment of the Constitution has been repealed. Repeat, the First Amendment has been repealed. More details to follow.
First daughter, Elizabeth, watches her presidential parents fall to a brutal assassination.
Breaking news. The President and First Lady have been killed in a terror attack.
Retired Navy SEAL Hayter Randall would do anything to defend his country. He's shocked as his ex-girlfriend and the current first daughter stage a coup and take over the United States. As chaos and martial law reign, Randall watches in horror as Elizabeth repeals the First Amendment and begins a campaign of televised public executions. Can the ex-SEAL and his rebels take down an unhinged dictator before America falls? Freddy Cruz, When America Fell Silent, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and thefreddycruz.com.